Welcome to Men Making a Difference, PGSAO men who inspire and motivate.
Hello, Doyle Nieman. How are you?
I am doing very well.
Great.
Good.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited to have this discussion with you because I really want the public to know who you are. They often get to hear from me as the state's attorney. I know that some people know you because you're a former delegate, but you also play a very significant role here in the office. So I want them to know who you are, what you do here, and then I'm going to ask you a few other questions. So why don't you first tell everyone about your role in the office?
All right. So I have been in the office for almost 23 years here as an assistant state's attorney. So I've gone up through the ranks and done most everything there is. I serve now in chief of operations, which is technology and space and things. But more important, I am the head of the conviction and sentence integrity unit, which you created when you took office as a new initiative to really address some serious problems that, getting a lot of attention now, but have been problems for a long time. So we do two primary things. We look, on the first hand, we look for wrongful convictions. And we try to make sure that people aren't convicted of crimes they didn't commit. It's one of our ethical obligations, and we do take it seriously. But there are things, as we know and have seen, where mistakes are made. So our job is to try to look at those mistakes and investigate it, or claims that we have a wrongful conviction. That's how it starts. Somebody claims that, well, they're innocent and they were wrongfully convicted, and then our job is to go investigate that and see if indeed that's the case. And if it is, then to take immediate action to try to get them released. That's one thing we do. The second thing is we look at sentences and whether or not there was an issue of fairness, justice, and appropriateness in a sentence. Right now, our primary focus has been on juvenile lifers. These are young people who are juveniles under the age of 18, committed a serious crime, and usually it's a murder or a rape, when they were a juvenile, and they got a sentence of life imprisonment, and they've spent now a long time in jail. And the question is, are they different from the person who committed the crime? And the Supreme Court has sort of set out a framework for this. They've understand and they've accepted what we now know scientifically in terms of brain development and child development, that young people, juveniles and what we're now calling emerging adults who are under the age of 25, really are not fully developed in their brains. They don't have the same degree of impulse control. They don't understand the consequences of what they do. They don't have any understanding of risk and reward and cost. And they do impulsive, stupid, and inappropriate things. But it's not a reflection of their true character. So they're not inherently incorrigible and beyond redemption. Supreme Court said that in that case, there needs to be a mechanism for the court and the legal system to look at those cases and say, should they continue to be locked up for long periods? So that's kind of what we do. In Prince George's County, we've identified more than 80 folks who were juveniles and received a life sentence, and 58, I think, somewhere in that range, have been in jail for more than 20 years. So they're the ones we're particularly looking at, that they've committed a crime. We're not arguing about that. And they've now spent a good portion of their life, many cases, the majority of their life, in prison. They've had a chance to be rehabilitated in some ways, to take note of the crime they committed, and also to change. So we're trying to create a way to review those cases and a mechanism to do something about them.
And can you talk about some of the challenges that we face trying to do this work? It's new, I think, for state's attorneys, certainly in Prince George's County, and I think throughout the state of Maryland, to take these proactive steps to really address what may be a disproportionate sentence, even though the crime itself was a very serious crime. But looking at what is just, and not just from the standpoint of when we prosecute cases or when we recommend sentences, but now we are on the back end, the person has been convicted, sentenced, and now we're relooking at their sentence and determining whether or not it's appropriate, and really looking at the whole person. So what challenges do we face, you know, especially legally? What are some challenges in the legal system that may prevent us from moving as quickly in doing this type of work?
Well, particularly with the sentence issue, there's no real clear mechanism to look at many of these cases. And there are a variety of protections built into the system that come into play early in the process after a conviction. People can appeal, they can ask to have a new trial, they can ask for reconsideration, they can file a complaint saying they didn't get good legal counsel. But in many of the cases we're looking at, that's already been done, and the courts have said there wasn't an issue. So we're now left with the question of, well, is it in light of today and who these people are as individuals today, and what we know about how children basically develop, is the sentence appropriate? And we don't have a clear mechanism for that. The legislature had some proposals last year, and they'll come back this year, which we supported, to set up a way to formally look at that. Not to ensure people are released, because we're not suggesting that's the answer across the board, but to look at each individual case in light of what we now know and say, should there be some reconsideration? And should we give these people an opportunity to have a second chance after after suffering considerable punishment and spending a lot of time in jail?
Recently, the Justice Policy Institute issued a report really talking about the disproportionate sentencing in Maryland, the numbers of particularly Black men who are sentenced and are serving time in our prisons, and those who are sentenced for 10 years or more. I think something like 80+% of those are Black men. So my question to you is, how can the work of a unit like yours really impact not just the juvenile lifers, but this issue around disproportionate sentencing and mass incarceration?
Well, we try to be very aware and cognizant of that. So we set up mechanisms to track the outcomes in terms of race and the nature of the crime. An example, sort of with your initiative, we just took a look at all of our conviction for marijuana possession. It's a minor offense, but it has serious, significant long-term consequences for people, far more disproportionately than the nature of the crime they're committed of. And a lot of people, the laws change and attitudes change. So we looked at the racial background of those in particular, and there was a clearly disproportionate number of Blacks who were convicted of possession of marijuana. First we found that the decision of who got convicted, who got a sentence and got all the negative things associated, was somewhat arbitrary anyway, because only a small percentage of people charged with the crime ended up being convicted. But those who were tended to be disproportionately Black or Hispanic. And so we filed motions to vacate all those convictions of anybody who had possession of a marijuana or paraphernalia as a conviction. because it just wasn't, the consequences were disproportionate to the crime, because attitudes have changed, and it made no sense to leave those convictions on the record. We haven't heard the outcome of that yet, but we, that's one of the things we could do. It's up to the court to decide whether to agree with us or not, but we're hopeful.
Absolutely. And, I want to kind of delve in a little bit more on this emerging adult population. Our office, again, taking the lead on, looking and delving a little bit deeper into this population because, they are responsible for a significant portion of the prosecutions that we do here in the office. And because of their age, number one, if they are sentenced to lengthy times, they're going to spend a lot of time in jail or in prison, really. And because of their age, also, they have the greatest capacity for change and rehabilitation. How do you believe we can really impact our justice system in a positive way with respect to this population, both keeping our communities safe, because safety is really important, and we do have victims, people who are convicted in these cases have committed very serious offenses. They're not sentenced to long sentences because, they, did something relatively minor. These are major crimes. It's armed carjacking, it's armed robbery, it's attempted murder. I mean, these are significant crimes, but still with that, we know that there is a capacity for these individuals to actually become different, better people. So how do we kind of address that? How do we speak to that? How should the state's attorney's office really, begin to have those conversations with our community and our justice stakeholders?
And I think, I certainly agree with what you've been saying, and it's about time. I mean, smart prosecution is not just about locking people up. It's about making our community safer and about changing behavior, especially for all but the most serious crimes. They're going to be out. We send them to jail. They're going to be out of jail in not that long a time. And the evidence we found in my personal experience in being a prosecutor is that putting people in jail is one of the least effective ways to change their behavior. Now, it stops it while they're locked up, but it doesn't really address any underlying factors. And in fact, jail is like advanced education for criminals. So you go and you hang out and you meet with other people who committed crimes, and you learn how to be a better criminal, and you make networking and contact. It's like going to graduate school for criminals. And so it doesn't always make sense just to throw people into a cell and think that somehow will change things. So the first step is to try to identify the cases. And we've begun with your leadership to identify people who are in that emerging adult category. And we're going to be asking, I think, our different units to look at each of those cases and try to identify whether there's an alternative that makes sense, that keeps people from committing more crimes and keeps the community safe, but that also begins to change behavior. And I know we have some initiatives that you put forward that are starting in that pathway, and clearly we need a lot more. It's a debate and a discussion in the larger community about programs to rehabilitate people and to change their behavior. But that needs to be our criteria. How do we ensure there's a consequence for a crime, but also a consequence that changes behavior?
Absolutely. And that is a challenge. I think the easiest thing to do is to lock someone up. The harder thing to do is to care about them after they are locked up. And so we definitely have, I think, a responsibility. And I like having folks like you in the office who understand our responsibility. That's very helpful to have like-minded partners in the office. But, there are still challenges, right? And so there's some challenges that are legal challenges or our laws. Like, what are some things we can do in Annapolis? And also looking at our sentencing guidelines, are those appropriate for emerging adults? I mean, sentencing guidelines on the one hand, kind of, gives, judges ranges as a guide of how to sentence someone depending on their criminal history, the nature of the offense, and all of that, so that we don't have this disproportionate sentencing. But is that appropriate for this emerging adult population, or should we look at them differently? And I'm just throwing this out there as just questions, because I think these are things that we have to really talk about. And then the amount of resources that we put in to them. Unlike, let's say, the juvenile system, where the standard there is best interest of the child. And so everyone's working really hard to figure out, how do we make this child whole? How do we prevent this child from reoffending? And the sentence imposed for juveniles is supposed to be really catered around that, right? But in the adult system, it's different. So should we be looking at the standards? Should we be looking at the services? I mean, what do you think? Like, what are your ideas around that?
Well, the good news in Maryland is we don't have mandatory sentencing.
Sure.
They're voluntary and discretionary. And so we have a fair bit of freedom. What we don't have particularly are alternatives that make sense. As you said, it's the easy thing is to lock people up. But that doesn't change them. So when they come out in a few years, then they are more likely than not to go back to committing crime. So we need things that provide them, an alternative that works. I mean, you can't just say, well, we're just going to slap your hand and walk away and think that changes anything, because it doesn't do that. And we certainly see a lot of examples of that, of people who've gone through the system one after another, and nothing really has changed. So, and I think you've identified it as a resource issue. That's the issue, is we need resources that put people into situations. Now, here in Prince George's County, we've just begun to make progress. We have, before the pandemic at any rate, we had the Community Release Center, which was sort of a place where people could be, who had been convicted of a crime, could be placed in that. They would sort of work release. They would have counseling and assistance and training, education assistance, and real ongoing monitoring of their activities. So if there's a problem, if there's a relapse, many of them have drug problems or mental health problems. So if there's a problem, somebody could step in and intervene. And that's kind of the important part. And that's a lesson from the juvenile system, in that, when somebody goes into the juvenile system, basically they're there, and it's an ongoing relationship aimed at, when it works right, which is not always the case, but when it works right, aimed at changing behavior and reforming folks. Well, we need the same thing for the adult world, particularly the emerging adults, because they're the ones that are the easiest to change their behavior. And the folks who are committing crimes, even the violent crimes that are impulsive crimes, that are crimes of anger and lack of self-control, lack of empathy and understanding that, what they do impacts on other people in a significant way, that we know there are alternatives out there. That's kind of the lessons we've learned from, psychology, if you will. But we don't have very good programs to put them into practice.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. But we are building those, and we are going to be advocating for those. And I know that we have partners in the General Assembly, like Delegate Daryl Barnes, who's the chair of the Black Caucus, who's reached out to our office and asked, "Hey, how can I help you get funding for some of the programs that you all want to initiate?" So we do appreciate having those partnerships, because you're right. It's how we're spending our resources, and because obviously with the pandemic, with the economy is not getting any better anytime soon, but there's still resources out there, and the question is how is it going to be used? Is it going to be used purely as a way to impose punitive penalties on people, or will we be able to also be more restorative? And that's, I think, what we're really looking at here, and so I'm very hopeful. Even during this time, I think that there's innovation that we can bring to our system of justice, and we're going to be leading it. And quite frankly, your unit is going to be doing a lot of that work and a lot of that advocacy. So it's great for me to have someone who has the know-how and also the relationships in Annapolis and beyond to assist us in getting the resources that we need. So thank you so much for your work here in the office.
It's been a great pleasure, and I think you've made a great start, and we've got just much more to do.
Absolutely. So I'm going to let you have the final word. So is there anything that you want to say about, because you've been around this justice system a little while, and you've seen it change and evolve over time. Where do you think we're headed next? Like, what would you say is sort of like the direction that we must head, and what will the role of the prosecutor be in the future of our system?
I think it's time for smart prosecution is really what it comes from. And so we have a lot of attention now about criminal justice reform, and what's really required is a balance. And I think as prosecutors, we're in a position to provide more of the balance. Because on the one side, you got folks who just want to lock people up. And that's a little bit out of favor at the moment. And the other side, you've got people who say, well, don't lock anybody up. But if you just ignore crime, it gets worse. It doesn't change. So you need a balance to say, yes, people do bad things, and there need to be a consequence to the bad things, and we need to acknowledge it. But we need to act responsibly to change that behavior and ensure that they don't go back and continue to do bad things. So ignoring it doesn't do that, but also locking them up and forgetting about them, momentarily anyway, doesn't do anything either. So I think as prosecutors, we are in a position to understand that, to bridge the gap that says we have to protect the community. That's our job, keeping people safe. That's what law enforcement and the criminal justice system is about, or should be about. But we, have to also take note of that, it's a long-term struggle, and we need to do it in a way that makes sense down the road.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself. but thank you so much, Doyle. Thanks for joining me today, and thank you all for listening. And until next time, have a wonderful, wonderful day.